The signal reached Earth on a Thursday morning. 14 words. No preamble, no diplomatic framing, nothing that suggested the sender had paused to consider how it would land. Just 14 words transmitted on a frequency that Earth Fleet's communication networks had been programmed to flag for 34 years, on the off chance that anything ever came through on it again. The message said, "We are coming home, please clear the Kalahari corridor. We are not small anymore." The communication officer on duty read it once. Read it again. Read it a third time with her finger hovering over the verification key, because some part of her was convinced that reading it a fourth time would produce different words, and she wanted to be wrong about what it said before she made it official. She wasn't wrong. She flagged it, called her supervisor, and then before protocol could catch up with her, she did something that appeared in no training manual and that she would be quietly embarrassed about for the rest of her career. She put her hands over her face and cried. Not from sadness. From the specific physical shock of something you have accepted as gone for 34 years turning out to not be gone. The body has its own response to that. It doesn't ask permission. Her supervisor read the message over her shoulder and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he reached past her and hit the escalation key with the careful deliberateness of a man making sure he didn't make a mistake on the most important thing he had ever done at work. 34 years earlier, the 7th Exploratory Fleet had entered the Kalahari Void with 847 ships and 90,000 people. The mission was 3 years of deep space mapping in one of the least charted regions within reach of Earth's extended navigation networks. Routine in the way that only an optimist classifies 3 years in an unmapped void as routine, but planned for, supplied for, crewed with people who had signed up specifically, because they wanted the kind of work that happened at the edge of what was known. 3 months in, the communication relay network failed. Not one relay, the cascade kind of failure that starts with one node and follows the connections outward like a fire following dry wood. 6 relays went down in 11 hours. The fleet was cut off in the time it took to understand what was happening. Earth sent rescue missions. 3 of them over 6 years, each one getting closer than the last, none of them close enough. The Kalahari Void had a specific character that made it difficult, not impassable, but requiring navigational techniques that Earth's fleet hadn't yet refined, and each rescue mission had come back with more data and better maps and the same result: no contact. The fleet was formally declared lost in service on a gray November morning 11 years after the disappearance. The ceremony was in Geneva. Names were carved into white stone, 90,000 of them, arranged in columns that took 48 minutes to walk end to end. The carving took 3 years. No one said they were dead. The official language was lost in service. But monuments are monuments, and white stone is white stone, and after 11 years and 3 failed rescue missions, the distinction between lost and gone had become the kind of thing that people stopped drawing in polite conversation. Admiral Dashavaro was 27 when the relays failed. She is 61 now. She was a junior captain of a small survey vessel when it happened. Competent, promising, the kind of officer who got flagged in evaluations as someone to watch, but who hadn't yet been given anything large enough to show what she could actually do. The 7th Fleet's senior command structure had other people for that. Most of that senior command structure was gone within the first decade. Some died. Some retired from command roles when age and the specific demands of sustained void operation made continuation impossible. Dasha had risen not through planning or ambition, but through the relentless process of being the person still standing when standing was what the situation required. She had left behind a daughter. Maya had been 2 years old. Dasha had a photograph, kept in a sealed case that maintained internal humidity and temperature, because she understood that the photograph was irreplaceable and treated it accordingly. A 2-year-old girl in a yellow dress, standing in what appeared to be a garden. Dasha remembered the garden. She did not remember exactly what it had smelled like, and that specific gap in her memory was something she had thought about more than she could account for. Maya was 36 now, somewhere on Earth if she was still alive. Dasha didn't know. She had no way of knowing. She did not allow herself to think about it when there was work to do, which, in 34 years of leading 90,000 people through the most isolated situation any human fleet had ever survived, was always. Her granddaughter Juno was 19, born on the ships specifically, born on the UES Meridian in the Medical Bay, on a Tuesday morning when the nearest star was 2.3 light-years away, and had no name in any human database. Juno had her grandmother's jaw and her grandmother's habit of going very quiet when she was feeling something she hadn't found words for. She had never seen Earth except in photographs. She had never felt rain. She knew what rain was. She had been told about it in careful, almost reverent detail by people who had last experienced it 34 years ago and still remembered the smell of it, the sound of it on a hull, the specific weight of wet clothes. She had read accounts of it. She had seen it in archival footage. She had not felt it on her face. That was the thing about being born in the void. You knew exactly what you were missing. You just couldn't know how it felt until you stood in it. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sira Huang had been 24 when the relays failed. She was 58 now, and she had spent 30 years writing everything down. It had started as a personal project, a journal, kept because the deep isolation of the Kalahari void had made her understand. In the bone-deep way you understand things when you have no choice but to sit with them, that nothing lasts forever and that the specific texture of a day is the first thing you lose when time moves past it. She wrote what happened. She wrote what people said. She wrote what the light looked like through certain viewports at certain hours, what the recycled air smelled like during specific seasons of the ship's artificial climate cycle, what it sounded like when 90,000 people were doing ordinary things in ordinary ways on a fleet of ships 340 light-years from the planet that had sent them. What started as a journal became a practice. What became a practice became a mission. Over 30 years, she had filled storage cabinets with handwritten volumes, one for every year, some years with multiple volumes because too much had happened to fit in one. Births, deaths, discoveries, arguments that lasted months and resolutions that took years, the names of children born in the void and the names of the people those children grew up to be. She had written it all down, so none of it would get lost again. Because she knew, in the way she knew things that she had spent 30 years with, what it meant to lose something. And she had decided, somewhere around year 4, that she was not going to let the 34 years of this fleet's life disappear into the dark the way the fleet itself had disappeared. Whatever else happened, the record was going to exist. The record existed. 47 volumes, handwritten, organized by year, accessible to anyone who wanted to read them. The births were in there. The deaths. The moment in year 12 when Chief Engineer Kova had figured out the Kalahari void's mineral composition well enough to smelt hull material from local resources, which had changed everything. The first ship built entirely in the void, hull number 848, launched with a ceremony that Sira had described in 8 pages, because 8 pages was what it deserved. The record existed, she had made sure of it. Intelligence Chief Wex had been tracking the fleet's signals for 3 years. The signals were faint, necessarily so, because a fleet hiding its presence in a contested corridor approach didn't broadcast loudly. But they were there, if you knew what to look for, and Wex knew what to look for because knowing what to look for was what he did. He had filed reports. He had updated those reports as the signals grew stronger, which they did as the fleet drew closer over the 3 years. He had attached analyses, projections, estimated fleet configurations based on the energy output signatures. His most recent report had been filed 4 days ago. The summary section said, estimated contact at Kalahari corridor approach in approximately 96 hours. Current signal analysis suggests a fleet significantly larger than historical records indicate. Mass signatures are inconsistent with the vessel classes that departed 34 years ago. All available evidence suggests the fleet has undergone substantial modification and expansion during its time in the Kalahari Void. Recommend no intercept posture. The last line said, "Do not intercept. We do not know what we are intercepting." Fleet Marshal Orankal had read the report. He had set it on his desk with the specific care of a man filing away information that he had already decided didn't change anything. Orankal had controlled the Kalahari corridor for 12 years. 73 vessels had come to him for passage and 73 vessels had been turned back or taxed or redirected, because the corridor was his to control and controlling it had become the defining fact of his professional identity. He was good at it. He had never been wrong about it. 847 ships, he said. From 34 years ago, we have 180 warships. He looked at his display. Whatever condition they're in after 34 years in the void, the mathematics are straightforward. Wex had looked at him with the expression of a being who has been right about too many things to be surprised by not being listened to, and had gone back to his station, and had started writing a contemporaneous record of the decision-making process. Because Wex, unlike Orankal, was thinking about what the report after this would need to contain. At 3:40 hours, Sensor Chief Drail's board lit up. He was running his standard mid-watch scan of the Kalahari approach routine, expected to produce nothing, the kind of task that existed to make sure there was a record of nothing having appeared every 4 hours. He had run this scan 847 times in his posting here. It had never produced anything. It produced something now. He ran a count. The number came back wrong. He cleared the scan and ran it again. Same number. He ran it a third time with the array's highest resolution settings and let it take twice as long. The number was 2,400. He looked at it. He was a professional. He kept his voice level when he called the fleet marshal, and he was proud of that afterward, because it was harder to do than it sounds when you are looking at a number that is approximately 3 times what you expected, and the things producing that number are showing mass signatures that your instruments are struggling to process. Fleet Marshal, he kept his eyes on the board. I have contacts on long range. The count is, he stopped for a half second. Sir, the count is 2,400 vessels. That's not possible. I have run it 4 times. They left with 847 ships. Sir, he was still looking at his board. His professional composure was working. It was working hard. The ship configurations don't match any database entry. They're not standard human hulls. Some of them are, sir, some of them are very large. The largest mass signatures are reading at 12 kilometers. Silence on the channel, specific silence, the kind with weight. Behind Orankal, Wex said, very quietly, the largest hull class they had when they left was 1.8 kilometers. Orankal looked at his display as the contacts resolved. 2,400 ships at the edge of his sensor range, moving through the Kalahari approach in a formation that his tactical computer was attempting to classify and returning the notation. No match found. He looked at Wex. Wex looked back at him with the patience of someone who had been doing this for a long time. How confident are you in your estimates? Orankal asked. Very, Wex said. I've been tracking their signals for 3 years. I told you what was coming. He paused. I put it in writing 4 days ago, specifically. Orankal looked at his display. He looked at his 180 ships. He did the arithmetic, which was the same arithmetic he had always done in situations like this one, the arithmetic that had served him well for 12 years. He did it again with the new numbers. The new numbers produced a different answer than the arithmetic had ever produced before, but 12 years of being right had a gravity to it, and gravity is hard to escape when you've been in it long enough. Set intercept formation, he said. We are not moving. Wex sat down. He opened his report file. He started writing. On the lead ship of the returning fleet, Lieutenant Commander Theo Ockhaffer pulled up the tactical display and looked at the Shethari blockade with the focused attention of a man who has spent 34 years hearing about things from his parents' generation and is now seeing one of those things for the first time. He was 34 years old. He had been born on a ship. His mother had been a navigation officer on the UES Carver before she transferred to the expanded fleet during his childhood, and she had told him about Earth the way people tell children about places they love and miss, carefully, warmly, with the specific detail of someone trying to give you something they can't physically hand you. He knew Earth from stories. He knew rain from descriptions. He knew the smell of grass from his mother closing her eyes and saying, like green if green were a smell, and clean, impossibly clean, and also there's dirt underneath it, good dirt, the kind that means something grew there. He had navigation instruments he trusted the way most people trusted gravity. He also had instincts, fast, loud, often right, that he sometimes trusted more than the instruments, which was correct about 90% of the time, and had produced 3 incidents in his career that he preferred not to discuss. 180 ships, he said, pulling up the blockade configuration. Standard cordon pattern. Radial coverage with a central command position. Commander Wallen used this exact formation in 2089 when he blocked the Dreneth trade route. The fleet logs have it catalogued under. Theo, Admiral Varro's voice. He looked up. She was at her command position, the chair that had come off the original Meridian 30 years ago, and had been repaired so many times that it was essentially a philosophical object at this point. A chair in the sense that a river is the same river even when all the water has changed. She was looking at her display, not at him. Yes, Admiral. I know the formation. Right, he looked back at his board. They're hailing us. I know. Are we answering? She looked at the blockade. 180 ships in a formation pattern she recognized from files she had read before he was born, between her fleet and Earth, between 340,000 people, and the planet that 90,000 of them had left, and 250,000 of them had never seen. Between her and a daughter, who was 36 years old, and whom she had last seen at age 2 in a yellow dress in a garden whose smell she could no longer fully remember. Not yet, she said. Beside him, Juno Varro was at her secondary navigation station. She wasn't primary crew. She was there because Dasha had quietly arranged it, the way grandmothers arrange things without appearing to arrange anything. She was looking at her screen the way she looked at things she was still deciding how to feel about. She was 19. She had her grandmother's jaw and her grandmother's silence, and a lifetime of hearing about Earth from people who were no longer sure their memories were accurate, which made the stories both more precious and more uncertain. She had seen rain in footage. She knew approximately what it felt like based on 34 years of people trying to describe it to children who had never experienced it. She looked at Earth on the long-range display, a dot at this range. She was going to stand in the rain in approximately 19 hours. Her hands were perfectly still on her console. Orancal's transmission was everything Wex had expected it to be, formal, authoritative, the voice of a man who had been doing this for 12 years, and had the manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He invoked corridor regulations. He cited transit protocols. He described the Shethari Dominion's legal authority over the Kelhari approach vectors in language that was precise and completely beside the point. He told them they required inspection and clearance before proceeding. He told them failure to comply would be treated as a hostile incursion. On the Meridian, Dasha listened to all of it. She sat in the salvaged chair and let the transmission finish, with the patience of a woman who had spent 34 years making decisions at the moment they needed to be made rather than the moment she felt ready to make them, which was a habit that had started as necessity and ended as character. When the transmission finished, she looked at Theo. Time to Earth at current speed. 19 hours, 20 minutes. Time for them to get reinforcements here. Nearest Shethari base. He ran the calculation, 22 hours minimum. She nodded once. She opened the channel. Fleet Marshal Orancall. Her voice was what 34 years had made it, not loud, not warm, not cold. Stone. The specific quality of something that has been subjected to significant pressure for a long time and has not broken. My name is Admiral Dashavaro. I command the 7th Exploratory Fleet of the United Earth Navy, returning from 34 years of unscheduled deployment in the Kalahari Void. I have 2,400 ships and 340,000 people. She paused for exactly one breath. We are going home. You can move aside and be part of a story people tell for 1,000 years, or you can make this harder than it needs to be. Another breath. I'm giving you 4 minutes to decide, not 5. She closed the channel. Theo looked at the display, at the blockade, at the 4-minute clock he had instinctively started running in his head. You think he'll move? No, she said. She was already pulling up the tactical display. But I wanted him to have the chance. 4 minutes expired. Dasha didn't hail again. She had given 4 minutes because she meant 4 minutes, and the 4 minutes were done, and there was no 5th minute available in her accounting. Theo, Kalahari-wide full fleet. He was already entering the parameters. He had memorized the formation years ago. Everyone in the returning fleet's navigation corps had, because the Kalahari-wide was what you used in corridor situations. And corridor situations were the situation they had been preparing for since Dasha ran the first blockade simulation in year 12, and they had started thinking seriously about what coming home might actually require. What the Kalahari-wide looked like from outside was something that had no equivalent in any tactical database, because it had been developed in the Kalahari Void using 34 years of specific experience with the corridor's spatial geometry, and it had been refined in simulation and practice, until it was not a theoretical construct, but something the fleet could execute in the time it took Orancall's tactical computers to realize they were looking at it. It was an expanding geometric, 2,400 ships arranged in a pattern that covered the maximum spatial volume in a narrow corridor, not presenting a clean engagement front, but presenting 2,400 individual targeting problems at 2,400 different ranges, angles, and approach vectors, all of them reconfiguring on a schedule that the pattern's mathematics generated automatically, so that by the time a targeting solution was calculated for one ship, that ship was somewhere else. Orancall's formation commanders started asking questions over the fleet channel within 30 seconds. The questions had the quality of professional people trying to apply existing frameworks to something that didn't fit any of them. Dasha watched the confusion on her tactical display with the patience of someone who had been calculating this moment for 2 decades. 6 minutes before they adapt, she said. Theo was watching the geometry. How do you know it's 6? Because I ran it 4,000 times. She looked at the display. Engage their port flank, drive systems only, no life support, no crew sections. What the fleet's weapons were, by this point, bore approximately the same relationship to the original armaments as the ships themselves bore to their original hulls. The same origin, utterly transformed. 34 years in the Kalahari Void, with its specific mineral compositions and electromagnetic properties, had given Kova's engineering teams material properties that appeared in no database, because the database entries were written by people who had never had access to those materials. The weapons that used those materials had capabilities that could not be predicted from the original specifications. When 200 ships opened fire on the Shethari port flank, the targeting was coordinated across the fleet's distributed network, a system that treated 2,400 ships as a single targeting organism, compensating for the confusing wide formation automatically, firing from the calculated actual positions of ships rather than the positions their visual signatures suggested they were in. 30 Shethari ships lost drives in 40 seconds. On the command ship, Drail looked at his board. He was a professional, and he had the professional's instinct to explain what he was seeing in technical terms. But technical terms required categories, and the categories he had were not matching what he was looking at. He looked at it anyway. Orankal was looking at the same thing. The certainty that had held him together for 12 years, the arithmetic of 180 against 847, the confidence of a man who had never been wrong, was undergoing a specific kind of structural change that didn't happen loudly. It happened quietly, like ice becoming water. You didn't hear the moment it happened. You just noticed that what had been solid was no longer. Another 40 seconds, 20 more Shethari ships, drives offline, life support running, crews alive. They're not, Orankal's tactical officer stopped, restarted. They're not targeting crew sections, sir. The precision, he ran the analysis. Every shot has hit a drive or weapons component, nothing else. Orankal looked at Wex. Wex was writing his report. He didn't look up. I mentioned this in my most recent filing, he said, without inflection. The signals we tracked over 3 years showed consistent weapon discharge patterns during their internal practice runs. The precision was notable. I included it in the summary. The Kelhari wide had moved through the outer third of the blockade. 2,400 ships were now inside the corridor. Orankal ordered a focus strike on one of the 12-kilometer ships. The focus strike hit. The 12-kilometer ship, built around the original hull of a survey vessel that had been 800 meters long when it left Earth, now encased in 34 years of expansion and modification. The original hull a small core deep inside a structure of staggering size. The ship reported minor damage to outer hull plating. It kept moving. The same speed. The same heading. It did not respond to the strike in any way that suggested the strike had mattered. Orankal watched his focused salvo land on a 12-kilometer ship and register as cosmetic damage, and something changed in the room that you could feel but not name precisely. It was the moment when a man's framework for a situation, the framework he has been operating inside for long enough that he has confused it with reality, quietly stops being useful. Wex at his station looked up from his report for the first time in an hour. He looked at Orankal. He looked at the display. He looked back at Orankal. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the display wasn't already saying. 63 minutes after the 4-minute window closed, 104 Shethari ships had lost drive capability. None had been destroyed. None had lost life support. None had casualties beyond injuries from the shock of impact. The remaining 76 mobile ships were moving, not toward the returning fleet, away from the corridor's center. They were making room, doing it with the specific deliberateness of a force that has calculated its options and found one that does not require further testing. The corridor was open. Dasha opened the channel to Orankal. Not to celebrate, not to demand acknowledgement. She opened it because there were 104 disabled ships with crews on them, and the practical reality of crews on disabled ships was something that required addressing regardless of how those ships had come to be disabled. Fleet Marshal, your disabled vessels are running life support and all crews are accounted for. My medical teams have capacity to assist if any of your personnel require support before your recovery fleet arrives. If you have injured who need immediate attention, transmit on Channel 7. Silence a long one. Then Orankal's voice, stripped of its formal register, stripped of 12 years. Why? Because they're your people. She kept her voice level, not warm level, not a tactical factor, your people. She closed the channel. In the ready room off the bridge, Dr. Sira Huang came to find her 20 minutes later. Sira was carrying volume 22. She set it on Dasha's table without being asked, without explaining why she had chosen that one. She just set it there and stepped back. Dasha looked at it, a handwritten volume, the spine worn from 30 years of Sira's careful handling. She looked at Sira. Volume 22, Sira said. The year Juno was born. Dasha opened it to the last entry. Sierra's handwriting, small, careful, consistent across 30 years, filled the page. She read, Admiral Varro held the baby for 2 hours after the birth. She did not allow anyone to see her face during this time. When she returned to the bridge, she worked 16 consecutive hours without pause. She has not mentioned the day to anyone since. She doesn't need to. We all know who she was thinking about. Dasha's hands were still on the pages. The recycled air moved through the room's ventilation. Somewhere in the fleet, 340,000 people were doing the ordinary things that 340,000 people did: sleeping, working, looking at the long-range displays that were now showing Earth as more than a navigational notation. A planet. Their planet. Most of them had never seen it, but they knew it the way you know something that has been described to you with enough love that the description becomes almost real. You wrote everything down, Dasha said. Everything, Sierra said, so none of it gets lost again. Dasha sat with that. She sat with the journal in her hands and 34 years behind her and 19 hours ahead of her, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, she let herself think about Maya. Not quickly, the way she usually thought about her, a flash, contained, filed away before it could cost her anything. She sat with it. She thought about a garden she couldn't fully remember the smell of, and a yellow dress, and a 2-year-old's face in a photograph kept in a sealed case for 34 years. 36 now, wherever she was. She closed the journal, set her hand flat on the cover. She would go through it properly later. She would go through all 47 volumes. She stood, there was work to do. 18 hours, Sierra said. I've been counting. Something moved in Dasha's face, small. Of course you have, she said. Earth saw them coming 17 hours before they arrived. Every sensor array in Earth's solar neighborhood picked up the contacts simultaneously and produced the same reading. 2,400 vessels. Approach vector from the Kalahari corridor. Configurations unknown. Mass range from standard to something that pushed the upper limits of what the arrays were calibrated to measure. 3 verification teams, all 3 confirmed. Then someone cross-referenced the IFF transponders. The identification codes, 34 years old, still transmitting on the original frequencies, embedded in ships that had grown to 12 times their original size and carried the codes, because some things you don't replace even when everything around them has changed. The verification officer made the match, pulled up the historical record, looked at the flag status that had been attached to those transponder codes 11 years after the fleet's disappearance. Lost in service. She looked at her board. She looked at 2,400 contacts on approach from the Kalahari corridor. She put her hand over her mouth. Then she transmitted to Earth Fleet Command 4 words: they're coming home. Theo was at navigation 17 hours later when Earth filled his forward display. Not a dot, not a navigational notation. A planet, blue and green and white, cloud cover moving across the oceans, light coming off the water in a way that didn't look like anything he had seen in 34 years of viewports, because what he had seen in 34 years of viewports was the Kalahari Void's specific dark and the Kalahari's specific stars, and nothing in any of it that looked like this. He had known what Earth looked like. He had photographs, archival footage, his mother's descriptions. He had known. He hadn't known what it felt like to see it with his own eyes. His throat tightened. He didn't try to make it not do that. There was no one on the bridge who would have judged him for it, because there wasn't a person on the bridge who wasn't doing some version of the same thing. Juno was at her station. She was looking at the same display. She was very still in the way she went still when she was feeling something she hadn't found words for, and she hadn't found words for this. Hey, Theo said. She looked at him. We're actually going. She looked back at the screen. The planet was getting larger with each passing minute, and it was going to keep getting larger, and in a few hours it was going to be so large that a viewport couldn't hold it. "Yeah," she said. Her voice did something it didn't usually do. "We're actually going." The UES Meridian was the first ship to enter Earth orbit. It had been 847 meters when it left. It was 4.2 kilometers now. The original hull was still in there, somewhere at the core, recognizable to the people who had served on it for 34 years and entirely invisible from outside, encased in everything that had been built around it over the years. It carried the same IFF transponder it had left with. It carried the same designation. It was recognizably itself, in the way that people are recognizably themselves after 34 years. Dasha stood at the viewport. Earth filled it. The blues, the greens, the whites. The cloud cover moving over the oceans the way she remembered it moving, except that her memory was 34 years old and the sight in front of her was now. And the difference between a memory and a thing in front of your eyes is not a difference you can prepare for. She let herself look at it. Not quickly, not with one eye on the next task. She let herself stand at the viewport of the ship she had commanded for 34 years and look at the planet she had been going home to for all of them. She thought about Maya. She thought about the photograph in the sealed case. She thought about what it would mean to knock on a door somewhere on that planet and find out whether the person on the other side was the person she had been thinking about for 34 years. She didn't know what she would find. She was going to find out. They went down later that day. The transport shuttle brought them through the atmosphere in the early evening local time, when the light was going amber and low, and the air outside was doing what Earth air does in autumn evenings, which was something no photograph had ever managed to fully capture. The shuttle touched down in a field outside Geneva. The field had been chosen for its size, because the diplomatic reception required space for the kinds of crowds that showed up when something that had been lost for 34 years came home. The crowds were there. The reception was there. There were people with signs and people with cameras and people who had been watching the approach feeds for 17 hours without sleeping, and whose faces showed it in the specific way that prolonged emotion shows on a face when it has finally resolved into the thing it was building toward. Juno Varro walked out of the shuttle and stopped. It was raining. Not heavily, the kind of rain that doesn't commit to being rain, that exists somewhere between mist and something more, that turns the air into a thing you can feel against your face. It was raining, and it smelled exactly like her mother had described it, green, impossibly clean, with good dirt underneath. And the sound of it on the shuttle's hull behind her was the sound she had been told about and had imagined and had filed away under things I will know when I know them. She turned her face up. She put her arms out, the way her mother had told her people did when they stood in rain they had been waiting for, and she stood there. Dasha watched from the shuttle doorway. Theo was somewhere behind her, and she could hear him saying something to someone, and there were people everywhere. And somewhere on this planet there was a door she was going to knock on, and 34 years of unfinished things were standing in a queue waiting for their turn. All of that was true. Right now, she was watching her granddaughter stand in the rain with her arms out and her face up, and she was letting herself watch it, and she was not thinking about the next task or the next decision or what came after this moment. She was just watching. For the first time in 34 years, she let herself stop working. The rain fell. Juno didn't move. The amber light came through the clouds in the specific way it did on Earth in the evening, the way no other light in the Kalahari void had ever managed to replicate, and it landed on the field and on the people and on a 19-year-old girl who had been born 340 light-years from here and had finally arrived. Dasha stood in the doorway and watched and did not say a word. Some things don't need words. Some things only need the standing there.